What do you mean there's no fuel gauge? Yeah, it's true. There's no fuel gauge. Okay, so what am I supposed to do? Well, what you do is, you see when this light comes on, you put fuel in it. Now, I've owned this bike for 8 months and I've had the bike on the road for 5 months. So I'm going to let you know what I think of this bike with my 5 months of experience riding this bike. I have used this bike for, you know, bike meets, just generally enjoying the bike. I've used the bike for commuting. I've used the bike for a charity ride out. So what do I think of this bike then? Well, I remember the first time I ever saw one of these. I was at a bike show, and there was this beautiful red Triumph Daytona 675, and until that point I actually didn't know that they existed. But I instantly remember looking at the bike and thinking, could this be the best looking sports bike ever? And I still have that same opinion. Now, on the subject of opinions, I do think that she looks a little bit like Toothless from How to Train Your Dragon. But all joking aside, I do still think this is one of the best looking sports bikes ever. And this is an early one. I mean, they brought these out in 2006, and this is a 2006. And they went on to do various cosmetic changes, and they've done various other versions. But it is still a stunning motorbike. Of course, one of the things that attracted me to it is the undertail exhaust, and a lot of people won't agree, but I am a fan. I do love a bit of symmetry, which is why I love an undertail exhaust, so I'm always going to be a fan of them. Although admittedly, I have to say, this particular one doesn't work for me. You know, I'm not hating on Arrow. The exhaust does sound good, but for me, it's a bit too loud. Sounds a bit like a straight pipe diesel. Now, anyone who knows these bikes, who knows these triple engines, will recognise that telltale sign of the whine of the triple engine. But as I say, this exhaust doesn't work for me. It just sounds too much like a straight pipe diesel car, which is fine if it was a straight pipe diesel car, but it's not. But in the near future, we'll trade that out for a stock exhaust, and we'll see how we get on with the stock sound of this bike. On the dashboard then, we have my preferred digital speedo and analog rev counter. There's also a gear indicator. Don't have one of them on my other bike. I'm a big fan of gear indicators, so I'm happy to have that. Clock seems simple enough. Don't have that on my other bike. Got it on this one. But yes, there's no fuel gauge, which I thought was going to be a problem. And it really isn't a problem. It's just, I think if you drive a car, fuel gauges are standard equipment, and so you expect a fuel gauge. But it seems as though, and I didn't know this till I got this bike, it seems as though a lot of sports bikes, or bikes in general, a lot of them just seem to not have a fuel gauge. I thought it was going to be a problem. It isn't. Simply as a case of, when the light comes on, you put fuel in it. There is no storage under this seat. I mean, well, I guess you've got a tiny little bit there. I mean, tiny little bit. I thought I was doing bad on my other bike, on my 125. At least on the other one I can store a disc lock under here. But realistically, if you're into your sports bikes, you probably wouldn't even be expecting to get storage. And if you're not expecting to get storage, then you won't be disappointed, because there is none. As for how comfortable this bike is, well, I don't have a problem commuting on this bike, going bike shows, bike nights, just going out for a bit of a ride. I typically don't have a problem, although I did do a charity ride out and I was on this bike for 2 hours, and that was pretty hellish. I mean, after an hour I was ready to get off, so bear that in mind. You don't want to do more than an hour on a bike like this. One thing I will say, I am 6'2", and a lot of my height is in my legs. On this bike I am pretty squashed, certainly in comparison to my other sports bike. The Daytona has foot pegs that are pretty high and handlebars that are pretty low, which would potentially set you up really well if you intended on taking this bike onto a track. I don't. So what I'm going to do, I know when I'm riding this bike, the bottom half of me is squashed. I can feel it, it's not comfortable. The bike's definitely not set up very well for me. My knees come quite far up the tank here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my rear sets for those off of a street triple. That will essentially lower the foot peg by about an inch, maybe an inch and a half. And some people have told me not to do this, because they're saying, no, don't lower your foot pegs, because then you're going to catch your foot pegs on the floor, etc, etc. And I get people are trying to give me some helpful advice. If I was taking this bike to a track, then yeah, they're right, I wouldn't do that. I would just stick with these. Continuing on the subject of comfort, one of the previous owners had set the suspension on this bike incredibly stiff. I mean, it was like riding a rock. The spring at the back there was squashed. There was almost no suspension travel. Same with the front forks. This bike has got fully adjustable suspension front and back, and unfortunately, yes, it had been set particularly firm, which again wouldn't be necessarily a problem if you were taking this bike to the track. In fact, if you're taking a bike like this to the track and you can get one with fully adjustable suspension, absolutely do it, because you're going to want it, you're going to need it. But for a street bike, it was like riding a rock. So I have softened up my suspension to make it more user-friendly on the road, but at some point I may have to change this rear spring. This is a progressive spring, and I may have to go with a linear spring. Apparently that helps. And then once I've done that, I will be getting this bike set up professionally by someone who knows what they're doing with suspension. Having fiddled with this bike's suspension and made it a little softer, I have made the bike, as I say, I've made it more user-friendly, made it more bearable to use on the road. And with that in mind, yes, this bike, you can definitely use it as a daily. I've used it commuting, I've used it just out and about, pottering around. It definitely can be used as an everyday bike, and I'm glad of that, because when I first got on this bike, it just, as I say, the suspension, it was like riding a rock, and I didn't gel with this bike to start with. Whereas now, suspension set up more for the road, hopefully get those pegs lowered, maybe change that exhaust so that my ears don't bleed every time I go out, and then hopefully I'll have a pretty sorted and comfortable Daytona. So yes, it is possible, or at least I believe it's possible for me to get this bike to a point where it's lovely and comfortable. And before we move away from the question of comfort, I do just want to say, yes, most people don't buy a sports bike for comfort. I certainly didn't buy a sports bike for comfort. I bought it because of how it looks. Yes, I don't mind admitting it. I just bought this bike because it looks absolutely awesome. But you have to be able to live with it at the same time. You know, I'm not expecting the comfort of a cruiser, for example. You know, I'm not expecting top level, top notch comfort, but I do just need to be able to live with this bike. And that's what I mean when I say I think it's possible to make them more comfortable for the road. Aesthetically then, gorgeous bike, yes, but I think Triumph drop the ball in one or two areas. First of all, there are 3 shades of gold going on this bike. The forks here and the calipers, it's subtle, but they're not the same shade of gold, and the exhaust also is another shade of gold, which wouldn't bother some people, but it does bother me. Personally, I think those calipers need to be black, and I think Triumph realised that because on the later models they did make them black. Then you've got these engine covers here, which are they're a nothing colour. I don't know what they were supposed to be. It might work on some bikes. If you've got a cafe racer with a lot of metal showing, you know, then maybe this sort of brownish, greyish colour would be a nice blend. It would be a nice mix. But on a motorbike that's primarily black and red, they just don't work. In my opinion, the engine covers need to be gloss black. And on the subject of gloss black, what are Triumph doing with these wheels? They are again, they're a nothing colour. They're not grey, they're not silver, they don't shine, they don't stand out, and that isn't this particular bike. That's the early Daytonas. The early Daytonas just had these, in my opinion, these terrible wheels that are some shade of grey or silver or something. And again, against the backdrop, I mean, I know this one's red, but against the backdrop of a gorgeous red and black bike, these wheels should absolutely be gloss black along with those engine covers. But of course, that's just my own personal opinion, and if I keep this bike long enough, then I will change the colour of those 3 things. But it really is just personal preference on this particular bike. Performance wise, well, this bike always puts a smile on my face. Apparently these bikes have 123 horsepower. There is some confusion about how much horsepower the 2006 model has. There is some suggestion that they only have 106. But for the most part, everywhere you look says 123. I don't know about this particular bike because I've never had her on the dyno to find out. As for how much one of these is going to cost, well, you could do what I did and get yourself a project, get it cheap, put the work in, get it on the road. But if you want to buy something that doesn't need any work, well, jump on eBay, jump on Auto Trader, and you'll probably find that these bikes start from about £3,500.